The wind carried a sharp bite that morning, the kind that scraped across a man's skin and made him feel every mile of hard country stretching from the trading post to the far line of the mountains. Folks said winter came early in that part of the frontier, rolling down from the high ridges like a cold hand, pressing over every ranch, cabin, and lonely trail. But even the cold wasn't enough to quiet the talk rising around the wooden platform in town. People leaned in close, boots crunching frost, voices low, eyes sharp. They weren't gathered for cattle or horses or tools. They were gathered for something far stranger, something that made even the bravest ranchers keep their hats pulled down and their words tucked tight. A bride no one wanted. She stood at the edge of the platform, wrapped in a worn blanket someone had tossed over her shoulders at dawn. She didn't look up. Her hands stayed folded against her stomach, fingers cold and still. No one knew her story, not fully. Bits of it floated around like drifting snow, changing with every breath. Some said she'd come from a wagon that broke apart in the canyon trails. Others whispered she had no family left to claim her. A few claimed she was cursed, though no one dared say it too loud. Folks in the old American frontier held tight to fear like they held tight to their rifles, and once a whisper took root, it grew fast. Beside her stood the seller, a rough-faced man who'd traveled through towns with goods of all sorts. He tapped the frost off his gloves, raised his voice, and tried to make the moment sound like business instead of something that clearly made the crowd uneasy. He talked about how winters were hard, how the girl needed a home, how buying her meant giving her a chance instead of leaving her out in the cold. But his words didn't wash away the discomfort hanging over the place. Most men kept their hands firmly at their sides. Then the crowd shifted as someone stepped forward. A tall figure with broad shoulders and long black hair tied behind him walked with calm, even steps toward the platform. An Apache rancher. Folks knew him from the far side of the valley, the quiet man who worked land others claimed wasn't worth anything. He'd rebuilt that old ranch with little more than grit, strength, and a stubborn will that made some respect him and others fear him. He didn't talk much, didn't drink much, didn't bother with trouble unless it came knocking on his land. People stepped aside. Making a path without being asked? No. One expected him to stop in front of the platform? No. One expected him to look up at the seller, and no one expected him to say he'd buy the bride. A wave of disbelief moved through the crowd, boots shifting, breaths catching. Women glanced at one another, unsure whether to pity him or admire him. Men tightened their jaws, wondering what in the world a strong rancher like him wanted with a woman everyone else avoided. But he didn't speak again, didn't explain himself. He simply held out the payment with a steady hand, as if he were buying a saddle or a sack of feed. Nothing more. The seller stared for a long moment, surprised but not foolish enough to refuse. Money was money, especially with winter settling in. He nodded, handed over the rope that loosely hung near the girl's wrist, and stepped back. Like someone glad to be rid of a burden, the girl didn't move. She didn't protest. She didn't look up. The Apache rancher stood still, the cold wind pushing against his coat, the eyes of the whole town burning holes in his back. He didn't tug the rope. Instead, he crouched slightly so he wouldn't tower over her. He spoke low, voice steady, telling her she didn't need to fear him, that he wasn't taking her as property, that winter was coming fast, and no one deserved to face it alone. His words held weight, not because he forced them, but because they were true. And it was the truth that made her shoulders tighten, as if no one had spoken to her kindly in a long while. Slowly, she raised her head. The crowd fell silent. The rancher froze, not because she was frightening, not because she was strange, but because her face carried something that struck him deeper than any wound or memory could. For a heartbeat, he forgot the cold, the crowd, and the long road home. He saw pain in her eyes, a pain so raw it pulled the breath straight from his chest. There were faint marks along her cheek, old ones healed, but still visible under the morning light. There was fear too, but behind it was a strength that didn't match the thin blanket or tired posture. She looked like someone who had survived more than any person should have to endure. And something else flickered across her face. Faint but unmistakable. Recognition not of him, but of something she saw in him, enough to make her step back. The rancher steadied himself, unsure why his hands felt suddenly colder than the morning air. He had come expecting a simple thing, a quiet act of mercy, nothing more. But what stared back at him wasn't simple at all. It felt tangled with secrets, with danger, with a story he didn't yet understand. Someone in the crowd muttered that she looked wrong. Another whispered that the rancher should leave her. But he didn't move. He didn't listen. He kept his eyes on hers, trying to understand what had made her look at him like she knew something he didn't. She finally spoke, voice low and rough from nights spent in cold places. "You don't know who I am," that was all. The rancher's breath made a small cloud in the air. He didn't know why those words made his heart tighten, but they did. He answered softly, saying it didn't matter who she had been before. What mattered was the life ahead, the safe roof waiting on his ranch. He stood, keeping his movements slow, offering her his hand without pulling or ordering. She didn't take it. Not yet, but she didn't step away again either. The seller cleared his throat, eager to be done, but the rancher didn't turn. He waited, holding his patience like he held a wild horse, steady but firm. The girl's fingers slightly curled beneath the blanket, as if she were deciding whether to trust him or run into the winter woods, where she surely wouldn't survive long. Then she whispered, something so soft the wind almost carried it away, "They will come for me." Rancher's jaw tightened, not at her words, but at the fear behind them. He asked who she meant. She didn't answer. Her gaze drifted past him, toward the tree line, toward the mountains, toward something far darker than the cold. Snowflakes began to fall. A slow, steady warning from the sky. The rancher lifted his coat from his shoulder and draped it around her without touching her arms. She stiffened, but didn't shake it off. It hung over her like a shield. The crowd slowly thinned as people realized the moment wasn't turning into the spectacle they expected. They wandered back to their wagons, their horses, their shops. But a few stayed, watching from the corners of the street, waiting to see if the girl would walk beside the rancher or not. The world felt quieter when she finally lifted her hand, not to take his, but to point toward the distant foothills. He followed her gaze. He saw nothing. No riders, no smoke, no danger. But he felt it. Something was out there, waiting, in whatever it was. It was tied to the girl standing before him. She lowered her hand and whispered the words that sealed the moment. Words that chilled him more than the morning frost. "You shouldn't have bought me." Right. The rancher didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Not yet, because deep down he sensed she might be right, but even deeper. He sensed he couldn't let her face whatever waited in those hills alone. And before he could speak, before he could take even one step toward the path home, a sound drifted from the mountains. A faint, distant echo, one that didn't belong to the wind, one that made the girl's breath hitch, and her eyes fill with fear again. Something was coming. And the rancher realized he had no idea what he had just brought into his life. The rancher didn't look back at the town once he stepped off the packed snow, leading the woman toward the narrow trail that wound between the cottonwoods. The few folks who lingered muttered to one another, wondering why a man as steady and respected as him would take a bride no one else dared claim. But their voices faded with every step, swallowed by the quiet winter air. Only the soft crunch of boots and the distant call of a hawk followed them. The woman stayed a half step behind him, wrapped in his coat, clutching the blanket closer each time a gust of wind cut through the trees. She didn't speak, didn't ask where they were going, didn't question why he'd stepped forward at all. Her silence wasn't stubborn or cold. It was heavy, like she carried more inside her chest than any stranger could guess. The rancher felt her unease, not through words but in the way she walked, careful and alert, as if expecting danger to appear behind every tree trunk. When they reached the small bridge crossing the frozen creek, he paused long enough to hand her a pair of gloves he'd pulled from his saddlebag. She hesitated, staring at them like she wasn't sure she deserved something simple and warm. Finally, she slid them on, whispering a small thank you that barely carried across the cold air. He didn't press her. Pressing never helped a scared creature. He'd gentled enough wild horses to recognize the signs. Not all wounds left marks on the skin. Some hid deep, and forcing them open made things worse. They walked another mile before she finally found the courage to ask the question pressing against her breath. "Why did you buy me?" He slowed but didn't stop. He told her the truth, plain and simple. That leaving a person alone in winter felt wrong. That everyone else saw a burden, but he saw someone who deserved a place to stand. He'd lived enough years on the land to know one thing: nobody survived long with fear as their only companion. She listened without interrupting, her gaze fixed on the ground. Her fingers curled into the gloves, as though trying to hold on to the warmth in them. "I'm not safe to keep," she said softly. "Not for you. Not for anyone." He didn't argue. He didn't say she was wrong. Instead, he asked something else. "Who is coming for you?" She didn't answer. The silence that followed was thick and unsettling, like the wind had stopped just to hear what she might say next. But she kept her lips pressed tightly, and he sensed the fear wasn't just about danger. It was about memory. Whatever she'd lived through, she wasn't ready to speak it into the cold world. The ranch came into view as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with pale streaks of orange and pink. His land wasn't grand like the bigger spreads in the valley. It was carved from stubborn soil, fringed by pines, and marked by a small barn and a weathered cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. Chickens scratched near the coop despite the cold, and the old mule lifted its head at the sound of approaching steps. The woman stopped at the gate, staring at the cabin as if she were seeing something she didn't trust. The rancher shifted his weight, letting her take in the place before they stepped inside. He told her it wasn't fancy, but it was warm, and the roof didn't leak unless the rain turned sideways. Somehow that made the ghost of a smile touch her tired face. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, sending waves of heat across the room. A pot of stew simmered on the hook above it, filling the place with the smell of herbs and slow-cooked meat. She looked around slowly, taking in the wooden shelves, the handmade tools, the dried herbs hanging above the window, and the small table near the stove. Nothing in the cabin was expensive, but everything had purpose. He offered her the chair closest to the warmth. She sank into it like someone whose bones finally felt heavy. He poured her a cup of water and set a bowl of stew before her. She held the spoon with trembling fingers, not from cold, but from something deeper. The rancher didn't stare, didn't hover. He simply sat across the room and mended a torn strap from his saddle, giving her space to eat. After a while, she spoke again, her voice gentler. As if the fire softened something inside her. "You should have left me there." He told her he didn't believe in leaving people to winter. She studied him with eyes that seemed older than her face, like she had lived too many seasons in too short a lifetime. "You don't understand," she murmured. "I didn't run away from the people coming for me. I escaped from them." Put the strap down. Her hands tightened around the bowl. Her gaze didn't meet his. "They aren't far," she said. "They'll search every path. Every cabin, every ranch. They won't stop." He asked her what they wanted from her, but again she lowered her eyes, refusing to answer. He didn't push. She wasn't a prisoner here, and whatever truth she carried would come out when she was ready. Night crept deeper. When the wind picked up outside, brushing against the window panes with a sharp hiss, she flinched, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The rancher saw it. He knew the look. Not fear of the wind, but fear of footsteps and voices that lived in the memory of the night. He offered her the small room at the back of the cabin. It wasn't large, just a bed, a small chest, and a single lantern, but it was warm and safe. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the bed as though she didn't believe it was meant for her. "You can lock the door," he offered, keeping his voice steady. "I won't come in." Her throat tightened. Then she stepped inside and closed it softly, not locking it, but not leaving it open either. The rancher stayed awake long after the fire died down to embers. Something gnawed at him, not regret, but the knowledge that he had stepped into something far bigger than a simple act of mercy. She wasn't just a lost traveler or a woman cast aside by misfortune. She was running from people who wanted her back badly enough to ride through winter for her. And that meant they weren't the type to let go easily. Outside, the wind carried faint sounds from the hills. The rancher stood at the window, staring at the dark outline of the mountains. No torches. No movement. Just the sharp cold and the quiet scrape of branches against the cabin wall. He told himself it was only the wind, but he didn't believe it. Morning came slow, the pale light sliding across the snow. The woman stepped out of the small room, looking more rested but not less guarded. She thanked him for the warm bed, and he nodded, offering her coffee. She held the cup close to her chest, letting the steam warm her face. A few minutes passed before she finally spoke. The words he had been waiting for. "My name isn't the one they know me by." He didn't ask for her real one. Names carried weight, and she'd offer it when she felt safe enough to let it be spoken, she continued. Voice wavering. "I wasn't meant to leave them. I was never supposed to be seen in that town. They'll think you took me. They'll think you stole me," he exhaled, slow and controlled. It's the way he did whenever a storm gathered on the horizon. "Let them think what they want," he said. "You're here now." She stared at him with eyes that held years of fear and a sliver of fragile hope. Before she could reply, sharp crack echoed from the ridge above the ranch. Not a tree breaking, not a rock falling, a signal. Her face drained of color. The cup slipped slightly in her hand. "They've found me," she whispered. The rancher stepped toward the door, his jaw set, his heartbeat steady but strong. The cold air that rushed in carried more than winter. It carried the promise of danger, and as he scanned the ridge, he realized the warning she'd spoken yesterday was no distant fear. It was arriving now. Step by step, closer with every heartbeat, and whatever story she carried, whatever past hunted her, was about to collide with his quiet ranch in a way neither of them were prepared for. The rancher stood on the threshold, with the door half open, the cold cutting in around him while the woman hovered behind his shoulder. His eyes stayed fixed on the ridge where the sound had come from. The land lay quiet at first glance, just a stretch of pale snow, dark pines, and the slow slide of clouds over the peaks. Yet something in the way the birds had gone silent made his skin tighten. He stepped out onto the packed ground, boots crunching. The woman caught his arm before he went farther, her fingers gripping harder than she meant to. He looked down at her hand, then up into her eyes. Fear ran through them like a river. Not the kind a person felt when facing a harsh winter, but the deep, knowing kind that came from recognizing a threat too well. "You need to stay inside," he said quietly. "If they see me here, they will not talk first," she replied. "They will not ask your name. They will not care about this ranch. They will only see what they think belongs to them." The words sat heavy between them. He gently freed his arm, then nodded toward the hearth. "Stir the fire," he murmured. "Keep it bright. If anything happens, you take the back door and follow the tree line east. There is a gully not far from here. You stay low and do not run in the open." Her jaw trembled, but she lifted her chin stubbornly. "And leave you alone to face them." He did not answer that part. He stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind him. The barn stood a short walk away, its roof dusted with snow, the old boards creaking softly in the wind. He crossed the yard with long strides, every sense alert. His horses snorted inside when he pushed the door open, their breath rising in white clouds. They felt it too. Animals always did. He reached for the rifle hanging on the peg near the stall and checked it with practiced ease. It was clean, oiled, loaded. He slung the strap across his shoulder, then grabbed the shorter carbine as well, just in case someone came close. On the way back toward the cabin, he paused near the corral and turned slowly, letting his gaze travel across the basin, up the slopes, and toward the thick belt of pine where shadows already gathered. There, a small flicker of movement. A horseman slipping between the trees on the upper ridge. Too far to see clearly, but close enough to spot the dark shape against the snow. The rider stopped, then raised an arm, signaling someone farther back. The rancher's chest tightened. This was no wandering hunter. He knew the careful way of watchmen. He went back inside and set one rifle near the door, another behind the table where it could be reached without drawing attention. The woman stood near the window, knuckles white around the curtain edge. She let it fall when he entered. "How many did you see?" she asked. "Only one," he said. But he was signaling someone else. "They are scouting the land." She swallowed hard and turned away as if steadying herself. "They will not come all at once," she said. "They will circle first. They will watch for smoke, for tracks, for any sign that someone is hiding me." He studied her then, not as a frightened stranger, but as someone who knew the habits of those riding after her. That knowledge was worth as much as any bullet. "You grew up with them?" he asked softly. Her shoulders flinched at the question. "Not exactly," she replied, "but I live close enough to see how they work." She crossed the room and sat at the table, resting her hands flat on the rough boards. For the first time since he had brought her from town, she looked not just afraid, but angry. Not at him. At something behind her, something that had followed her across miles. He sat down opposite her. "You were sold," he said, "but not the way they made it sound at that platform." Her lips parted, then closed again. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. She stared at her gloved fingers. "They used me," she said finally. "Traded me like a bolt of cloth. Promised one man to another, promised my face and my silence. When I stayed quiet, they arranged a price. When I refused, they raised their hands." She did not describe more, but he did not need details. The marks on her cheek, the tension in her shoulders, the way she flinched from sudden noise told more than words. "The seller in town?" he asked. "Was he part of them?" "He was their friend," she said. "Their messenger. They wanted to hide me in plain sight. They thought if no one knew me, no one would question it when they came to collect. A bride delivered on a winter morning. A bargain sealed without anyone asking why. I never smiled." Her eyes lifted to his. "They did not expect you," she said. They did not expect an Apache rancher to step forward with enough money and enough courage to take what they thought they owned. Anger moved through him then, slow and controlled. Not the hot kind that made a man act foolish. The deep kind that had built in him over years of watching the way the world treated those it thought lesser. He had known what it meant to be judged by blood, by name, by the way his hair fell over his shoulders. Now he saw that she too had been judged by something she never chose. "How many men?" he asked. "How many are likely to ride down from those hills?" "At least 4, she answered. "Maybe more." They rode with a trail boss who did not care how he earned his coin. He bought and traded with both sides of the frontier. White ranchers, desert raiders. Anyone who paid, he will not take kindly to losing what he thinks he bought. The rancher leaned back slightly, thinking it through. 4 men against 1 rancher and an unarmed woman were bad odds. But this land was his. He knew every rock, every gully, every stand of brush. He also knew that sometimes the best way to protect something was not to stand in the doorway with a rifle, but to bring a problem into the light where others could see it. Yet going to town meant leaving her alone. The fire popped in the hearth, sending a small shower of sparks upward. She jumped again. "They might try first at night," she whispered. "Slip close. Listen at windows. Look for shadows moving inside." He nodded and stood, going to the small trunk near the bed. From it, he pulled an old wool coat, thick and heavy, and handed it to her. "You are not a prisoner here," he said. "If you choose to run, I will not chase you. But if you stay, we stand together." Do you understand that her eyes filled with something that wasn't quite trust yet? But wasn't only fear either. "What if they threaten your land?" she asked. "Your animals. Everything you worked for." "I have rebuilt this ranch once," he said. "I can rebuild it again. I cannot rebuild a life that has been broken beyond repair." For a heartbeat, she could not speak. No one had talked about her life that way in a long time. Outside, the sound of distant hooves drifted faintly through the walls, followed by silence again. They were closer now, checking the draws and gullies, searching for smoke, scanning for fences and tracks. The rancher moved to the small shelf by the door and took down a leather pouch. He set it on the table and opened it, revealing carved stones and a few small feathers bound together with a strip of rawhide. Old Apache symbols from his family, carried with him from a time before he chose this ranch. "My people say a man does not stand alone," he said quietly. "Not when he remembers who came before him. They taught me to listen to the land, to watch the sky, to read tracks. Those men out there think they are hunters." Closed the pouch again. "They have no idea this land already knows their weight." A knock sounded at the door then, sudden and sharp. The woman's breath caught fast in her chest. The rancher raised a hand, motioning for her to stay back. He picked up the rifle by the doorway, held it angled at the ground, and opened the door a narrow crack. It was not the men from the ridge, it was an older rider from town. A ranch hand who sometimes helped drive cattle through the valley. Snow dusted his hat brim, and his mustache was stiff with cold. His eyes flicked from the rancher's face to the shadow of movement behind him. "I just came from the trail," the man said. "Saw sign up on the ridge. A group of riders that don't belong to any of the local outfits. Wanted to make sure you knew." The rancher stepped outside and pulled the door mostly closed behind him. The woman stayed near the hearth, heart hammering. "They are after someone," the ranch hand continued in a low tone. "Word in town is they had business with that trader. Some say a deal went wrong. Others say their property got away. You know how talk spreads?" The rancher's jaw set. "You told anyone?" "You were coming here?" he asked. The man shook his head. "No, but people notice when strangers take interest in an Apache rancher who brings home a bride that nobody else wanted. Folks were watching when you left with her. I reckon if those riders ask the right questions, they will learn fast where to go knocking." The rancher thanked him and pressed a small sack of dried meat into his hand, a quiet sign of respect. The man tipped his hat, gave him a sober look, and turned his horse back toward the main trail. When the door closed again, the woman looked at him. Reading his face before he spoke, "They know," she whispered. "Soon," he said. "Not yet. We still have a little time." She sank into the chair, rubbing her palms over her skirt as if trying to wipe old memories away. He watched her for a moment, then spoke in a softer tone. "You said they will come even in winter, that they will not stop." "They do not like losing money," she answered. "And they do not like losing control." He gave a slow nod. The main conflict was no longer just between a hunted woman and the men chasing her. It had become a test of what kind of man he chose to be. The quiet Apache rancher who kept his head down and his name clean, or the kind who risked standing up against men who believed the frontier belonged only to their coin and their guns. As afternoon slid toward evening, they worked in tense silence, preparing the ranch as best they could. He checked the shutters, the doors, the stash of wood near the back. He showed her how the latch on the small room's window worked, how she could slip out if the front of the cabin became unsafe. She listened carefully, nodding, committing every detail to memory. A subtle bond grew between them, formed not from soft words or shared laughter, but from the quiet understanding that their lives now ran braided together. Her danger had become his. His land had become her refuge, maybe her trap. As the first stars pricked through the darkening sky, she stood at the window again. The world outside looked still, but the stillness rang false. Somewhere beyond the tree line, men waited. Somewhere up in those ridges, horses snorted and stamped, and cold hands checked rifles and revolvers under wool coats. The rancher came to stand beside her, his shoulder barely touching hers, close enough for her to feel the steady strength of him. "They will test you first," she said. "They will talk like men who only want to settle a misunderstanding. They will ask if you saw a missing woman. They will show you a story that sounds kind and fair. They will lie." He turned his head slightly, watching her profile in the firelight. "How do you know that?" he asked. Her answer came slow, "As I've heard them do it before. For other people they wanted. For other things they would not let go." She drew a breath that shook a little. "They are good at pretending they are decent men." Outside, in the darkness beyond the fence, a horse snorted. Another answered it. Hoofbeats thudded faintly in packed snow. The rancher's hand tightened around the edge of the curtain. "They are here," she whispered. He let the curtain fall back into place and stepped away. Picking up the rifle from by the door, his boots sounded heavy on the cabin floor, matching the weight slowly gathering in his chest. The knock that followed was not sharp this time. It was calm, measured, the kind a polite visitor might use at a neighbor's door. The sound of it cut through the cabin like a blade. The woman's eyes locked on the door, her whole body drawn taut. The Apache rancher stood between her and the entrance, the firelight flickering across his features, his shadow stretching long behind him on the wall. The knock came again, and he knew that whatever he said next, whatever he chose to reveal or hide, would shape not only the fate of his ranch, but the fate of the bride no one had wanted. The woman whose face still haunted him every time he closed his eyes. The knock settled into the wood like a warning, slow and steady, as if the men outside had all the time in the world. Inside the cabin, the air grew tight, thick enough that every breath felt louder than the last. The woman stood near the back room, her hands pressed against her chest as though holding her heart still. The rancher glanced at her once, a silent message passing between them. Stay hidden. Stay quiet. Trust me. He stepped toward the door, but didn't open it fully. He cracked it just enough to see the man standing on the porch. The stranger wore a long duster coat dusted with winter frost. His hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but the cold smile on his mouth didn't need much light. Behind him, 2 more riders waited near the fence, their horses shifting restlessly. Evenin', the man said with a courteous drawl that felt wrong in the winter air. Hope we ain't catching you at a bad time. The rancher didn't answer at first. He studied the man's hands, the lay of his coat, the way his boots were turned slightly inward, like he'd been standing there a while before knocking. What do you want? The rancher asked quietly. We're looking for someone, the stranger replied. A girl, young thing. Saw her in town. Smile widened by a hair. Seller says she ran off. Folks around here say maybe she came this way. The rancher didn't blink. I haven't seen anyone. The man dipped his head, pretending to accept the answer, though the glint in his eyes said he didn't believe a word of it. Well now, he said, that's the trouble with winter nights. Tracks get covered real fast. People get lost. Hard to tell who's where. The rancher tightened his grip on the door. No one is lost here. The stranger's gaze flicked past him, just for a second, toward the flicker of the fire inside. It was quick and subtle, but the rancher caught it. The man wasn't asking questions. He was confirming something he already suspected. The stranger leaned a little closer, lowering his voice to a friendly murmur that made the rancher's jaw clench. We ain't here to stir trouble. We just want what's ours. Bring her out, and we'll be on our way. The rancher lifted his chin. She doesn't belong to you. The man's smile vanished. In its place came a cold, flat stare. You don't know who you're dealing with. The rancher did not flinch. Then you don't know me. A long beat of silence passed. Then the stranger stepped back, placing his hands behind his coat as if taking a relaxed stance. We'll camp near the ridge, he said. Give you time to think it over. Winter's long. Accidents happen. Doors break. Fires spread. Don't make this harder on yourself. The rancher's eyes hardened. Leave. The man held his stare for a moment longer, then tipped his hat with a mock show of respect and walked away. The 2 riders followed him into the dark, hooves crunching through the snow. When the sound faded, the rancher shut the door and dropped the bar across it. He waited a long moment before speaking. His breath came slow, controlled. But the tension in his shoulders had grown heavier. They aren't going away, he said. The woman stepped forward, her face pale as moonlight. She sank into the chair near the table, fingers pressed to her temples. That man, she whispered. He was the one who arranged it. The trade, the deal. He was the one who said I had no say. The rancher crouched beside her, keeping a slight distance so she wouldn't feel cornered. Tell me everything, he said. Whatever you say stays between us. But I need to know what they want, why they want you. She lifted her eyes to his, and the rancher saw the weight inside them. The years of running, hiding, and being treated like something less than a person. She drew a shaky breath, then began. "The man you saw, they call him Cutter," she said. "He's not from any town. He trades with raiders, ranchers, miners, anyone who pays. He moves from place to place, buying and selling whatever brings the most coin, tools, horses, people." The rancher felt something cold settle inside him. "They took me from a wagon trail," she said. "I was going west with a family. Cutter's men stopped us one night. They said they needed supplies. They said it was business." Her voice cracked. She swallowed and kept going. "They killed the father when he tried to defend us. They took the oldest daughter. They tied me to a post." Her hands trembled. "But one night, one of their own turned on them. He cut me free, told me to run. I ran until my feet bled. I thought I was safe when I reached that small town." Her voice faltered as memories twisted through her. "But the man who freed me, he died because of it. Cutter found him first. Then he went looking for me. He told the trader that I was property, that he had bought me with blood. They didn't want me in town. They didn't want trouble. So they tried to hide me. Tried to sell me off quietly. Tried to give Cutter a clean path to claim me again." The rancher closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. The story fit every piece he had seen, and it made the threat outside even more real. She leaned forward, voice trembling. "I never meant to drag you into this. If I leave now, maybe they'll go. Maybe they'll think you gave me up." "No," the rancher said firmly. "You step outside alone and they'll take you. They'll hurt you, and they'll blame me anyway." She stared at him with eyes full of fear, guilt, and something unspoken. "Why would you risk all this for me?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out into the dark. The ridge lay still, but he knew the quiet would not last. Finally, he spoke. "Because I've seen enough men like Cutter to last a lifetime," he said. "And I will not let this land become a place where people like him walk where they please." She rose slowly from her chair. "What will you do?" He took a long breath. "I'll confront them, but not with guns, not yet. First, I need to know where they are, how many there are, and what they plan." Her hand gripped the edge of the table. "You can't ride out there alone. I won't go far," he said. "I'll circle the ridge. I'll watch from the trees. If they plan to storm this place tonight, I need to know before they move." A gust of wind hit the window, rattling the glass. She flinched again. "Then I'm going with you," she said suddenly, surprising even herself. He turned sharply. "You're safer here." "No," she said, stepping closer. "If they find me here alone, they'll take me before you return. I won't be helpless again." Her determination startled him, but he didn't dismiss it. She was stronger than she looked. Stronger than the winter, stronger than the fear hunting her. But he shook his head. "I need you to trust me," he said. "This is my land. I know every trail. If I move alone, I move quicker." Silence stretched tight between them. Finally, she looked down, her voice breaking. "I'm afraid for you." He didn't speak for a moment. Then he placed a hand gently on the table between them, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin. "I'll come back," he promised. She shut her eyes, the promise touching something deep inside her. He moved through the cabin, gathering what he needed. A thick coat, a small knife, the shorter carbine for silent distance. He blew out one lantern, leaving only the glow of the fire, before stepping outside. He paused in the doorway. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone, unless you hear my voice." She nodded, though her breath shook. He stepped into the cold. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The sky was a deep, frozen blue, studded with stars from inside. She watched him disappear into the line of trees. Every shadow outside felt dangerous now. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a warning. She paced the cabin, her hands shaking, her eyes flicking toward the window and door again and again. Minutes passed. Then an hour, then another. The fire burned low, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. She had just begun to reach for another log, so when a sharp thud hit the side of the cabin, she froze. Another thud followed, heavier, something brushing against the wall. Something moving. Her heart pounded so hard she thought the sound alone would give her away. Then she heard it, a voice. Low, rough, too close. Is she in there? Her breath caught. Bootsteps crunched outside, more than one pair. Slow, searching. They weren't waiting at the ridge anymore. They were here. A shadow passed the window. Then another. The woman backed away, hands trembling so violently she could barely breathe, and far out in the dark woods the rancher heard the same voices. He turned sharply, heart slamming in his chest, realizing the truth. Too late. They had not gone to the ridge to camp. They had circled behind him, and now the cabin that held the woman he had sworn to protect stood alone against men who did not intend to leave without her. The tension stretched to breaking. The conflict was no longer coming. It had arrived. The woman stood frozen in the dim cabin, the firelight shaking across her face as shadows moved outside. Voices crept along the walls, slow and searching, each one sending a cold jolt through her chest. She pressed her back against the small table, trying to stay silent, but her breath trembled so hard she feared they would hear it. The knock didn't come this time. Instead, the men outside spoke in rough whispers, arguing over where she might be, deciding whether to break the door open or circle to the back. She reached for the iron poker by the hearth, gripping it with both hands, her knuckles white. She didn't want to fight, but she had promised herself she would never again let someone take her without standing for her own life. The fire flickered weakly, and she felt the cold creeping through the floorboards. She whispered a quiet prayer that the rancher would return in time, though she didn't know how far he had gone or how many men blocked his path. Outside, the crunch of snow suddenly stopped. Silence wrapped around the cabin so quickly it made her heart jump. She held her breath and waited. A long moment passed. Then a boot scraped softly near the window. Another shadow stretched long beside the sill. Someone tried the back door latch. She heard a muffled curse when they found it barred. Another man whispered, "Check the front. Break it." Before she could decide what to do, a distant sharp whistle cut through the cold night. It echoed off the trees, quick and urgent. The men went still. That him one asked. Cutter said he'd signal if something changed. No answer came, but the whistle carried again, sharp as flint. The men outside muttered in confusion. One backed away from the window. Another shifted toward the porch. Then the woman recognized something the men didn't. That whistle wasn't Cutter's signal. She had heard it before, hours earlier, from the rancher when he called his horse in from the far pasture. A quiet code he used only for the animals that knew him best. Her breath eased just enough for hope to spark. One of the men stepped toward the front door again, preparing to ram it with his shoulder. But before he could, a dark form moved behind him with fast, silent steps. A strong arm hooked around him, pulling him back into the night without a word. Snow sprayed, boots scuffled, and then nothing but a muffled cry. The remaining two men turned sharply, just as another shadow moved between them. Firm voice cut through the cold. "That's far enough." It was him. The rancher stood tall in the dim light of the porch, coat brushing his boots, rifle held steady but not raised. His breath clouded the air, but his stance was calm, unshaken, solid like the land he lived on. "Let the girl go," one of the men snapped, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "Cutter said she's his. She's not property," the rancher replied, his voice low. "And you're not taking her anywhere." The man nearest the steps wavered. He wasn't as sure as the others. Maybe he had seen enough wrong in his life to know he was standing on the edge of another. "We don't need to fight," he said quietly, though his partner shot him a furious glare. "We don't get paid enough for this." "She belongs to us," the angrier man shouted. "We came for her, and we're not leaving without her." The rancher stepped closer, slow and even. "No one belongs to anyone. Not here. Not on this land." A deep breath shivered through the cold air. The two men looked at each other, not sure whether to run or attack. Then the back of the cabin door creaked as the woman stepped toward it. She had not opened it yet, but the sound was soft and carried enough weight to draw their attention. The rancher saw the flicker in their eyes and acted first. Not with violence, but with something stronger, with purpose. "If you ride away now," he said, "you walk out with your lives, your horses, and your freedom. Cutter won't chase you for losing something he never owned. And if he tries, you can tell him you found a rancher who wouldn't bend. He'll understand that." The men hesitated. One lowered his shoulders. The other shifted his feet uneasily, scanning the still trees. The rancher's calm confidence unsettled them in a way guns never could. "He's right," the quieter one said at last. "We don't need to be here, let's go." The angrier man cursed under his breath but didn't argue. Whatever strength he had came from numbers, not conviction. With a final glare, he backed away from the porch. The two men moved toward their horses, calling for the third man who had disappeared into the trees. They didn't realize the rancher had already tied him safely near the barn, away from harm, within moments. The riders fled down the trail, their silhouettes fading into the dark. The sound of hooves softened, then vanished completely. Only when the last echo died did the rancher lower his rifle. He turned toward the cabin as the woman pushed the door open and stepped into the light. Her eyes glimmered, not with fear this time, but with something warmer and heavier. Relief, gratitude. A weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she still carried. "You're safe," he said quietly. Her lips trembled. "You came back. I said I would." She stepped closer, the fire behind her painting a soft glow across her face. For the first time, she didn't look away from him. "It would have taken me." "They won't come again," he said. "Not after tonight." She hesitated, then shook her head. "Cutter might. He's not like the others. He won't forget what happened." "I'll deal with him when the time comes," the rancher replied. "But tomorrow, I'll ride into town. The sheriff needs to hear the truth. What those men have done. Will be hunted the same way they hunted others." She wrapped her arms around herself, overwhelmed yet steadier than before. "You risked everything," she whispered. He studied her carefully. "I didn't risk anything that wasn't worth protecting." Something in her expression softened then, a quiet acceptance she hadn't allowed herself to feel. She stepped closer, close enough for the warmth of his breath to brush her hair. "You changed my fate," she said. "No," he answered. "You changed your own. You faced them tonight." She looked down at her hands, realizing he was right. She had stood her ground. She had survived again. She had chosen her future. As the final tension of the night eased, the rancher opened the cabin door wider. "Come inside," he said gently. "You need rest. And tomorrow, we start fresh. No running, no hiding. You're safe here." She hesitated only a second, then stepped back into the warm cabin. The fire glowed brighter, the walls felt thicker, and the world outside no longer seemed as dark. He followed her in and closed the door behind them. Later, as the fire settled into glowing embers, she sat quietly at the table. Watching the orange light flicker over the wooden floor, the rancher sat across from her, repairing the strap on his saddle again, though his eyes lifted to her often. "So," she said softly, "what happens next you choose," he replied. "If you want to stay, this ranch is yours as much as mine. If you want to leave someday, I won't stop you. You're free now." Her breath caught at that word. Free. For the first time since her life had been torn apart. The word didn't feel impossible. She reached out, her hand resting lightly over his on the table, not forcing, not asking, just connecting. "I don't want to run anymore," she said. "Not when I finally feel like I belong somewhere." He met her gaze, calm and strong. "Then you're home." The wind outside softened to a gentle whisper. The danger had passed. The fear had loosened its grip. The ranch, quiet and steady beneath the winter stars. It felt like a place reborn. The bride nobody wanted had found the one man who saw her worth. And the Apache rancher, who had once lived a life of quiet solitude, now felt a new warmth in his cabin one. That came not from the fire, but from the future they had begun to rebuild together. The ending settled over them like a warm blanket, simple and true. Two lives crossing paths on a cold frontier night, two hearts learning to trust again, a place where fear finally faded and hope took its place.